Caleb Winters, a 16-year-old boy with a mop of scruffy brown hair and hand-me-down boots that pinched his toes, stood at the frost-covered window of his small living room. Outside, the season's first heavy snowfall blanketed the neighborhood, painting everything a pristine white. The modest houses on the street were lined with icicles hanging from sagging gutters, and Caleb's own home was no exception. The Winters house, with its peeling blue paint and a crooked mailbox, might have looked worn, but inside it was filled with the warmth of small joys. Caleb lived with his mother, Hannah, a nurse who worked long hours at the local clinic to make ends meet. Life was a constant stretch of pennies, but they shared a bond that turned their little house into a home. A place where the smell of pancakes on Saturdays and their nightly tradition of reading together brought light to even the toughest days. Caleb sighed and turned away from the window. His mom had already left for her shift before the sun rose, and the quiet of the house seemed heavier than usual. His backpack, packed with books and papers, sat untouched by the door since he'd managed to finish his homework the night before. Looking for something to do, he peeked back out at the neighborhood, noticing how thick the snow had become. Across the street, Mr. Abramson's driveway was buried under several inches, with no sign of anyone shoveling it. Mr. Abramson was an older man who kept mostly to himself. His house, larger than the others, stood with an air of mystery. The ivy-covered stone walls and wrought-iron gate gave it the look of something out of an old movie, and Caleb rarely saw him venture outside. Sometimes, Caleb imagined what it would be like to live in a house like that, but only briefly. The thought always felt too far away from his reality. The neighbors often whispered about Mr. Abramson, spinning stories of his reclusive nature. Some said he had been a world traveler, while others claimed he was a retired professor or even a war veteran. Caleb wasn't sure what was true, and he had only seen the man in passing. A tall figure with sharp blue eyes and a cane he didn't always use. Without thinking too hard about it, Caleb grabbed the old snow shovel from their shed. The handle was splintered and the blade was slightly rusted, but it worked well enough. His mom had always taught him that kindness mattered more than anything else, often telling him, "It doesn't cost a thing to be good to someone, Caleb. You never know when they might need it most." Those words rang in his ears as he trudged through the snow, deciding it would be better to keep busy than to sit alone inside. Reaching Mr. Abramson's driveway, Caleb paused for a moment, gripping the shovel. What if Mr. Abramson didn't want him there? What if he got upset? But Caleb shook off the thought and dug the blade into the snow. The work was harder than he expected. Each shovelful felt heavier than the last, but Caleb pushed through, imagining how relieved Mr. Abramson might feel to see the driveway cleared. He had no reason to do this beyond wanting to help, but somehow that was enough. And then they watched him. He gripped his shovel to clear. By the time Caleb finished, his arms ached, and his cheeks were rosy from the cold. He had just leaned on the shovel to catch his breath when the sound of a door creaking open caught his attention. He looked up to see Mr. Abramson standing in the doorway. The man's presence was commanding despite his age, and Caleb felt a pang of nervousness. "You didn't have to do that," Mr. Abramson said, his voice low but steady. "I know," Caleb replied, a little sheepishly. "I just thought you might need a hand. Snow's pretty heavy today." Mr. Abramson studied him for a moment, his sharp blue eyes narrowing slightly as if measuring Caleb's sincerity. Then, to Caleb's surprise, the man gave a small nod. "Well, you've done a fine job. Come inside for a moment. You look half frozen." Caleb hesitated. He'd never been inside the house before, and part of him wondered if he should just head home. But curiosity and the promise of warmth won out. He followed Mr. Abramson inside, wiping his boots carefully on the mat. The house was just as intriguing on the inside as it was on the outside. The air was filled with the smell of cedar and something faintly sweet, like freshly baked cookies. The walls were lined with bookshelves, and a crackling fire in the stone fireplace cast a warm glow over the room. Everything looked old but well cared for, from the velvet armchairs to the brass candlesticks on the mantel. "Sit," Mr. Abramson said, motioning to the couch. He disappeared for a moment and returned with a steaming cup of tea. Caleb took it gratefully, feeling the warmth seep into his cold fingers. "Why did you shovel the snow?" Mr. Abramson asked after a long moment, settling into the chair across from him. Caleb shrugged. "I don't know. I just thought you might need it. My mom says it's good to do things for others." A flicker of a smile passed over Mr. Abramson's face. It was brief, but it softened the lines around his eyes. "Your mother taught you well, thank you, Caleb." For a while they sat in companionable silence. Caleb sipped his tea, occasionally sneaking glances at the books and objects that filled the room. There were framed photos of faraway places, a globe with faded colors, and a model ship that looked like it might have taken months to build. When the tea was finished, Caleb stood to leave, thanking Mr. Abramson again for the tea and the warmth. As he stepped back outside into the snow, he couldn't help but feel lighter than when he had arrived. He didn't expect anything in return for his effort, but something about the simple act of helping and the old man's quiet gratitude made him feel good in a way he couldn't quite explain. Over the following weeks, snowstorms became a regular occurrence, and each time, Caleb grabbed his shovel without hesitation. Every time he finished, Mr. Abramson invited him in for tea. At first, their conversations were short, but as the winter deepened, they began to open up. Caleb learned that Mr. Abramson had once been an architect, designing buildings all over the world. In turn, Caleb shared stories about school, his love of writing, and his dreams of one day seeing those far-off places Mr. Abramson spoke of so vividly. A quiet friendship began to form between the boy and the old man, the kind that grew not from grand gestures but from simple, shared moments. What Caleb didn't know was that his small act of kindness was beginning to ripple in ways he couldn't yet see, planting the seeds for a future brighter than he had ever imagined. The days turned into weeks, and winter settled heavily over the neighborhood. Caleb kept up his routine, waking early to clear the snow from Mr. Abramson's driveway and sidewalk whenever a fresh layer fell. The shoveling had become almost second nature to him. Despite the work being physically demanding, Caleb didn't mind. Each visit meant more time spent with Mr. Abramson, who had become something of a mentor and friend in Caleb's eyes. The old man had a way of speaking that made even the most ordinary topics seem fascinating. He told stories about cities Caleb had only read about in books: Paris, Istanbul, Kyoto, describing their architecture and culture with such vivid detail that Caleb could almost see the bustling streets and feel the weight of history in the stones. For a boy who had never been farther than the next town over, these conversations were like a window to another world. One afternoon, after finishing his tea, Caleb noticed a small sketch pad on the side table next to Mr. Abramson's armchair. It was open to a detailed drawing of a bridge, its elegant arches framed by mountains in the background. "Did you draw this?" Caleb asked, picking up the pad carefully. Mr. Abramson glanced over and gave a small nod. "Yes, that's one of mine." "It's incredible," Caleb said, genuinely awed. "Did you really design stuff like this?" "I did," Mr. Abramson replied. "Architecture was my life for many years. I worked on buildings, bridges, and even a few cathedrals. It was rewarding work, but it's all in the past now." Caleb couldn't hide his admiration. "I think it's amazing. I mean, you built things that'll last forever. I don't know, it's kind of like writing a book, isn't it? People remember you because of what you leave behind." Mr. Abramson's expression softened. "I suppose it is. But you know, Caleb, the things we leave behind don't have to be grand to matter. Sometimes it's the small things we do for others that leave the deepest impression." The words stayed with Caleb long after he went home that day. Life at home hadn't gotten any easier. His mom was working extra shifts at the clinic to cover their mounting bills, and Caleb tried to help in small ways, tidying up the house, cooking simple meals, and even babysitting for a neighbor to earn a little extra money. Still, there were moments when the weight of their struggles felt overwhelming. The winter was harsher than usual, and their heating bills stretched their budget thin. Caleb noticed his mom skipping meals sometimes, claiming she wasn't hungry, and it made him wish he could do more. One particularly cold morning, Caleb arrived at Mr. Abramson's house to find the snow piled higher than usual. It had been a brutal storm the night before, and even the short walk across the street had left him winded. He set to work immediately, chipping away at the ice and heaving shovelfuls of snow onto the growing mounds beside the driveway. As he finished the last stretch, he heard the familiar creak of the front door. Mr. Abramson stepped out, his heavy coat wrapped tightly around him, and called out, "Caleb, come inside before you freeze." Caleb gladly followed him in, stamping the snow off his boots before entering the warm, familiar house. This time there was a tray of sandwiches waiting on the coffee table alongside the usual tea. "You've been working hard," Mr. Abramson said, motioning for Caleb to sit. "Eat something." Caleb hesitated but then gave in, realizing how hungry he was. He took a bite of a turkey sandwich, savoring the taste. As he ate, Mr. Abramson sat across from him, watching him with a thoughtful expression. "You remind me of someone I knew long ago," Mr. Abramson said suddenly. "Who?" Caleb asked, wiping crumbs from his hands. "My younger self," Mr. Abramson replied with a faint smile. "I was about your age when I first learned what it meant to work hard. My family didn't have much either, and I had to take odd jobs to help out. It taught me resilience, though I didn't always appreciate it at the time." Caleb nodded, understanding the sentiment. "It's tough sometimes, but my mom says the hard stuff makes us stronger." "She's right," Mr. Abramson said. "Your mother must be proud to have a son like you." The words warmed Caleb in a way he couldn't quite explain. As the winter dragged on, he found himself opening up more during his visits. He talked about the pressure he felt to do well in school, his dreams of becoming a writer, and his fear that those dreams might never come true. Mr. Abramson listened patiently, offering advice when he could and encouragement when Caleb needed it most. One day, as Caleb was leaving, Mr. Abramson handed him a small book. The leather cover was worn and the title, The Alchemist, was embossed in gold letters. "This was a favorite of mine when I was younger," Mr. Abramson said. "It's about chasing your dreams, even when they seem impossible. I think you'll like it." Caleb thanked him, tucking the book carefully into his coat before heading home. That night, he stayed up late reading, captivated by the story of a boy on a journey to find his treasure. Something about it resonated deeply with him, and he couldn't wait to tell Mr. Abramson about it the next day. As winter reached its peak, their bond grew stronger. Caleb's visits became less about shoveling snow and more about the connection they shared. What had started as a simple act of kindness was turning into a friendship that felt like a gift. Unbeknownst to Caleb, Mr. Abramson had been thinking a great deal about the boy and the quiet determination he saw in him. Watching Caleb's earnest efforts to help, despite his own struggles, had sparked something in the old man, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He began to wonder if there might be a way to give back to the boy who had shown him so much kindness. The days grew longer as winter began its slow retreat, but Caleb's visits to Mr. Abramson didn't stop. Even with the snow mostly melted, he continued to find reasons to stop by, whether to help with small tasks or simply to chat. Over the months, their bond had grown into something special, an unlikely friendship between a boy with big dreams and an old man with a lifetime of stories. One chilly afternoon, after they'd finished their tea, Mr. Abramson looked at Caleb thoughtfully. His usual calm demeanor had shifted to something more serious, and Caleb noticed the change immediately. "Caleb," Mr. Abramson began, his voice steady, "there's something I've been thinking about for a while now, and I'd like to discuss it with your mother first. It concerns your future." Caleb blinked, caught off guard. "My mom?" "Yes," Mr. Abramson said with a small nod. "I've seen the effort you've put into helping me these past months. You've shown me kindness, integrity, and a sense of responsibility far beyond your years. You've also shared your dreams with me, your desire to go to college, to become a writer, and I know how much those dreams mean to you. I want to help you achieve them." Caleb stared at him, the words hanging in the air. "Help me? How?" Mr. Abramson smiled faintly. "I'll explain everything when I speak with your mother. Do you think she'd be willing to come over for a conversation? I guess so, Caleb said, his heart pounding. But she might be a little suspicious. She doesn't like to feel like she owes anyone anything. I understand, Mr. Abramson replied. I'll make sure she knows my intentions are genuine. Later that evening, Caleb approached his mom, nervous but determined. He explained how Mr. Abramson wanted to talk to her about helping with his education. At first, Hannah seemed skeptical, crossing her arms as she listened. He wants to help you with college? She asked, frowning slightly. Yeah, Caleb said, shifting uncomfortably. I think it's more than just college. He hasn't told me everything, but he really means it, Mom. He's not just saying it. Hannah let out a long sigh. It's a generous offer, Caleb. Almost too generous. I don't know if we can accept something like that. He asked if you'd go talk to him, Caleb said. Maybe you could hear him out? He's a good guy, Mom, you'll see. Reluctantly, Hannah agreed, and the next evening she walked across the street to Mr. Abramson's house. Caleb stayed behind, pacing nervously in the living room. Inside the warm, firelit house, Hannah sat stiffly on the couch as Mr. Abramson poured her a cup of tea. He took his usual seat and began to speak, his tone calm and direct. Mrs. Winters, he said, I've asked you here because I'd like to discuss something important regarding Caleb's future. I've gotten to know your son over these past months, and I can't tell you how impressed I am by his character. He's hardworking, thoughtful, and full of potential. He reminds me of myself at his age. Hannah gave a polite smile, but her brow furrowed slightly. Thank you, Mr. Abramson. Caleb's a good kid, but I'm not sure where you're going with this. Mr. Abramson leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the arm of his chair. I'd like to help Caleb go to college. Not just help, actually. I want to pay for it entirely. Hannah's eyes widened and she shook her head quickly. That's incredibly kind of you, but it's too much. We can't possibly accept something like that. Please, hear me out, Mr. Abramson said gently. I'm not making this offer lightly, nor am I doing it out of pity. I see potential in Caleb, and I want to ensure that his talent and drive aren't limited by financial constraints. You've worked so hard to provide for him, Mrs. Winters, but I know how heavy the burden can be. Hannah hesitated, her voice soft but firm. It's not about being ungrateful, Mr. Abramson. It's such a huge gesture. I don't even know how we could repay you. You don't need to repay me, Mr. Abramson said, his voice steady. I have the means to do this without it affecting me in the slightest. You see, Mrs. Winters, I'm a millionaire. Hannah stared at him, stunned into silence. I've lived a modest life, Mr. Abramson continued. But I invested wisely and was fortunate in my career. At this point in my life, I have far more than I need, and I've been thinking for years about how I might use what I have to make a meaningful difference. Caleb's kindness and determination have shown me exactly where my resources should go. Hannah's lips parted, but no words came out at first. Finally, she managed, You're serious about this? Finally possessing some... I am, Mr. Abramson said with a nod. This isn't charity. It's an investment in a young man who deserves every opportunity to succeed. I don't have any family to pass my wealth on to, but I couldn't think of a better legacy than helping Caleb achieve his dreams. Hannah leaned back in her seat, her emotions swirling between disbelief, gratitude, and hesitation. It's a lot to take in, she admitted. I understand, Mr. Abramson said. Take all the time you need to decide, but please know that my offer stands and it comes with no strings attached. When Hannah returned home, she sat Caleb down and relayed the conversation. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke, her emotions still raw. He told me he's a millionaire, she said, almost laughing at how surreal it sounded. And he wants to use his money to help you, Caleb. Completely, without asking for anything in return. Caleb's breath caught. So, what do you think? I think we should consider it, Hannah said, her voice soft. It's not an easy thing to accept. But if this could give you the future you've dreamed of, how could I say no? Caleb felt his heart swell with a mix of gratitude and hope. Thank you, Mom. I promise I won't waste it. I'll make you proud. Hannah smiled, pulling him into a hug. You already do, sweetheart. The next day, Caleb and Hannah met with Mr. Abramson again, this time to talk about the specifics. As they sat together in the warm, book-filled room, Caleb realized just how much his life was about to change, all because of one simple act of kindness on a snowy morning. The decision had been made, and Caleb's life began to shift in profound ways. Now, 16, with high school graduation approaching, he threw himself into his studies with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt before. Mr. Abramson's promise to fund his education didn't feel like a safety net. It felt like a challenge, a reminder that someone believed in him and expected him to make the most of the opportunity. Mr. Abramson, true to his word, worked closely with Caleb and his mom to establish a college fund. Every detail was handled with care, from ensuring tuition and housing were covered to planning for smaller expenses like books and supplies. But he never let Caleb forget that success depended on his own efforts. This is just the beginning, Mr. Abramson reminded him one day. You'll have to work hard every step of the way. This isn't about me handing you a future. It's about you building one for yourself. I won't let you down, Caleb replied, the determination clear in his voice. The months that followed were a whirlwind. Caleb dedicated himself to his classes, particularly excelling in English and creative writing. With Mr. Abramson's encouragement, he started writing more regularly, pouring his thoughts and dreams into short stories and essays. You have a gift, Mr. Abramson said one day, after reading one of Caleb's pieces. Your words have a way of connecting with people. Don't ever underestimate the power of that. As the spring of his senior year approached, Caleb began the nerve-wracking process of applying to colleges. With Mr. Abramson's guidance, he reached beyond what he had initially thought possible, applying to schools with strong writing programs and scholarships for students with financial need. Each application felt like a leap of faith, but he submitted them with a growing sense of confidence. In early April, the letters began to arrive. Caleb would run home from school each day, his heart pounding as he opened each envelope. Some brought disappointment, but others brought joy. One day, he rushed across the street to Mr. Abramson's house, holding a thick envelope in his hands. I got in, he exclaimed, barely able to contain his excitement. It's my top choice, the university with the writing program we talked about. They're offering me a spot for the fall. Mr. Abramson's face broke into a wide smile. I knew you would, he said, his voice filled with pride. You've worked hard for this, Caleb, and now the real adventure begins. That evening, Caleb, his mom, and Mr. Abramson celebrated together. They gathered around the dining table in Caleb's home, toasting with glasses of sparkling cider. It was a simple celebration, but it felt monumental. Hannah smiled at her son, pride and love shining in her eyes. I'm so proud of you, Caleb. You've earned this. And you've supported me through everything, Caleb said, his voice thick with emotion. I couldn't have done this without you and Mr. Abramson. Mr. Abramson raised his glass, his expression thoughtful. This started because of one small act of kindness, he said. You shoveled my snow without expecting anything in return. That's a rare thing, Caleb. Doing good for the sake of doing good. And look where it's led. You've proven that kindness, hard work, and perseverance can create incredible opportunities. Shay didn't ask me whether my star should be hard work or perseverance, can create incredible opportunities. As Caleb sat there, surrounded by the two people who had shaped his journey, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. The snowy morning that had seemed so ordinary months ago had sparked a series of events that would change his life forever. He thought about his dreams of becoming a writer and the stories he wanted to tell, stories of hope, connection, and the power of simple, selfless acts. With college on the horizon, he felt ready to take the next step toward making those dreams a reality. And as he looked around the room, Caleb knew this was just the beginning of a story he couldn't wait to write. Summer arrived, and with it came a mix of emotions Caleb had never experienced before. The reality of leaving for college in the fall was exhilarating, but also a little daunting. The path ahead felt brighter than he had ever imagined, and it all stemmed from the snowy morning months ago when he decided to help a neighbor without expecting anything in return. Mr. Abramson remained an integral part of Caleb's life over the summer. Their conversations often turned to practical advice, how to manage money, stay focused on his studies, and navigate life in a new environment. One evening, as they talked in Mr. Abramson's cozy living room, the older man leaned forward, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Caleb, there's something else I'd like to do," Mr. Abramson began, his voice measured. "It's for both you and your mother." "What do you mean?" Caleb asked, looking up from his tea. Mr. Abramson took a small envelope from the side table and held it out. "I know how hard your mother has worked to give you every chance in life. I've seen her strength and the sacrifices she's made for you. I'd like to give her this, to help ease the burden a little." Caleb hesitated, his heart pounding as he took the envelope and opened it. Inside was a check for $5,000. His eyes widened in disbelief. $5,000? Caleb whispered, looking up at Mr. Abramson. "That's a lot of money." "It's a gift," Mr. Abramson said gently. "I've been fortunate in life, Caleb. I've always had more than I needed. This is just a small way to thank your mother for raising a young man with so much integrity and kindness." "I don't know if she'll take it," Caleb admitted, shaking his head slightly. "She's proud, and she doesn't like feeling like she owes anyone." "I understand," Mr. Abramson replied. "But this isn't charity, it's an acknowledgement of everything she's done. Let her know it comes from a place of gratitude and admiration. If she still refuses, I'll respect her decision." When Caleb told his mom about the check later that evening, she was stunned. $5,000, Hannah repeated, her voice trembling. "Why would he do that?" "Because he knows how much you've done for me," Caleb said. "He said it's not charity, it's his way of saying thank you. Mom, he's not just being generous, he really means it." Hannah sat at the kitchen table, staring at the check in her hands. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, I've never had anyone do something like this for us." "It's okay to accept help sometimes," Caleb said softly. "You've always done so much for me. Maybe it's time to let someone do something for you." After a long moment, Hannah nodded. "I'll write him a thank you note," she said, her voice still shaking. "And maybe bake him something. It's the least I can do." Over the next few weeks, Caleb and his mom prepared for his move to college. They shopped for dorm essentials, packed his belongings into boxes, and spent quiet evenings together, cherishing the time they had left. The check Mr. Abramson had given her helped more than she'd expected, covering overdue bills, fixing the car, and even allowing her to take a rare day off to spend time with Caleb. As a final gesture, Mr. Abramson invited Caleb and his mom over for dinner before Caleb left for college. The meal was simple but heartfelt, and the three of them talked and laughed late into the evening. After dessert, Mr. Abramson handed Caleb another envelope. "What's this?" Caleb asked, opening it cautiously. "It's a note," Mr. Abramson said with a warm smile. Caleb unfolded the paper and read aloud. "Caleb, you've already shown the world the kind of person you are. Kind, hardworking, and full of potential. Never forget that. Wherever this journey takes you, remember that your actions matter and that kindness can open doors you never imagined. This is just the beginning. With pride, Mr. Abramson." Caleb's throat tightened as he folded the note and tucked it into his pocket. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice filled with emotion. The day of Caleb's departure finally arrived. His mom drove him to campus, the old car packed to the brim with his belongings. Mr. Abramson stayed behind, understanding that this moment was for mother and son, but he waved goodbye from his porch as they pulled out of the driveway. At the university, Caleb stepped out of the car and looked around, taking in the bustling campus. Students were everywhere, unloading cars, carrying boxes, and chatting excitedly. It all felt surreal, as though he had stepped into a dream. Before he grabbed his bags, his mom pulled him into a tight hug. "I'm so proud of you, Caleb," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've worked so hard for this. Go out there and show them what you're made of." "I will, Mom," Caleb said, hugging her back. Once he was settled in his dorm room later that evening, Caleb sat on his bed, reflecting on everything that had led him to this point. He thought about his mom, who had sacrificed so much for him, and Mr. Abramson, whose kindness and generosity had opened doors Caleb never thought possible. He pulled out his notebook and began to write, his thoughts pouring onto the page. He wrote about snowy mornings and acts of kindness, about the quiet strength of his mom and the wisdom of an old man who had changed his life. As he wrote, he felt a deep sense of purpose, an unshakable belief that the future was his to create, shaped by the kindness and lessons he had been given. In the months that followed, Caleb stayed in close contact with both his mom and Mr. Abramson. He shared updates about his classes, his writing, and the new friends he was making. Each call to his mom was filled with her pride and encouragement, and each letter to Mr. Abramson brought thoughtful, encouraging replies. Caleb's story was just beginning, but he knew one thing for certain. The boy who had once stood in the snow with a rusty shovel had found a path shaped by kindness, generosity, and the belief that even small actions could change lives. And as he sat in the campus library one evening, working on a story for his creative writing class, he smiled, knowing he would carry those lessons with him wherever he went.